particularly interested in regard to the origin of psychological disorder and what is necessary to heal that disorder. Perhaps we could start with the question of what is the source of psychological disorder?
Yes, sir. And I would like to ask, if I may, what do we mean by disorder? When the whole world, as one knows, as one sees it from continent to continent, there is a great deal of disorder.
Yes.
Economically, socially.
This is one of a series of dialogues between J. Krishnamurti, David Bohm, Rupert Sheldrake, and John Hidley. The purpose of these discussions is to explore essential questions about the mind. What is psychological disorder, and what is required for fundamental psychological change? J. Krishnamurti is a religious philosopher, author, and educator who has written and given lectures on these subjects for many years. He has founded elementary and secondary schools in the United States, England, and India. David Bohm is professor of theoretical physics at Birkbeck College, London University in England. He has written numerous books concerning theoretical physics and the nature of consciousness. Professor Bohm and Mr. Krishnamurti have held previous dialogues on many subjects. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist whose recently published book proposes that learning in some members of a species affects the species as a whole. Dr. Sheldrake is presently consulting plant physiologist to the International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad, India. John Hidley is a psychiatrist in private practice who has been associated with the Krishnamurti School in Ojai, California for the past 6 years. In the culture, there are conflicting points of view about the proper approach to dealing with one's own or others' psychological problems. And the underlying principles from which these approaches are drawn are in even greater conflict. Without invoking a narrow or specialized point of view, can the mind, the nature of consciousness, its relationship to human suffering, and the potential for change be understood? These are the issues to be explored in these dialogues.
Is disorder the very nature of the self?
Why do you say that? Why do you ask that? Is it the nature of the self?
Isn't the self, the me, the ego,
Yeah.
whatever word we like to use, isn't that divisive? Isn't that exclusive, isolating process, this self-centered activity which causes so much disorder in the world? Isn't that the origin, the beginning of all disorder?
The origin being selfish activity.
Yeah, self-centered activity at all levels of life.
Yes, and certainly that's the way in which the patient comes in. He's concerned about his depression.
Yes.
Or his fear.
His fulfillment, his joy, his suffering, his
Yes.
agony, and so on. It's all self-centered.
Yes.
So I'm asking, if I may, is not the self the beginning of all disorder? The self, I mean, the egotistic attitude towards life, this sense of individual emphasis on the individual, his salvation, his fulfillment, his happiness, his anxiety, and so on and so on.
Well, I don't know that it's the source of the thing. It's certainly the way he experiences it and presents it. He presents it as his.
Yes, but if you go all over the world, it is the same expression. It is the same way of living.
Uh-huh.
They're all living their own personal lives, unrelated to another. Though they may be married, they may do all kinds of things, but they're really functioning from an isolated center.
And that center, that self, is the source of the difficulty in the relationship,
In the relationship.
and the difficulty that creates the symptoms.
And I wonder if the psychologists have tackled that problem. That the self is the origin, the beginning of all contradiction, divisive activity, self-centered activity, and so on?
No. I think that the way the psychiatrists and psychologists look at this is that the problem is to have an adequate self.
Adequate self.
Yeah.
Which means what?
Defining
A
normality
self that is functioning
sufficiently.
efficiently.
Yeah.
Which means furthering more misery.
Well, I don't feel that the psychiatrists would necessarily agree with you that, on that last point, that they might feel that a proper or properly organized self could get together with other properly organized selves and make an orderly society.
Yes.
And you're saying, as I understand it, something quite different.
Yes.
Which is
But
no self can do it. No structure of the self can make order.
that's right.
Right.
The very nature of the self must intrinsically bring disorder.
Yes, but I'm not sure this will be clear to, how can that be made clear, evident?
Well, sorry, it seems to me that this is the context is even broader than that of psychology. Because in the world we have all sorts of things which are not human beings with selves, animals and plants and all the forces of nature and all the stars and so on. Now we see disorder in nature too. It may not be consciously experienced, and a cat that's suffering or a lion that's suffering or a mouse or even an earthworm that's suffering may not come into a psychiatrist's office and say so. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that there seems to be disorder and conflict within nature. There are conflicts between forces of nature, of inanimate things, earthquakes and so on. There are conflicts within the animal world. There are even conflicts within the plant world. Plants compete for light, and the bigger ones get higher up in the forest, and the smaller ones get shaded out and die. There's conflict between predators and prey. All animals live on other plants or animals. There's every kind of conflict. There's disease, there's suffering, there's parasites. All these things occur in the natural world. So is the context of psychological suffering and disorder something that's merely something to do with the mind, or is it something to do with the whole of nature, the fact that the world is full of separate things, and that if we have a world which is full of separate things, and these separate things are all interacting with each other, that there's always going to be conflict in such a world?
I was wondering, is it clear that there is that kind of disorder in nature, or would we say that disorder is only in human consciousness?
Yes.
Now, that is what the phenomena that you have described, are they actually disorder? That's a question we have to go into. Or what is the difference between the disorder in consciousness and whatever is going on in nature?
I saw the other night on the television a cheetah chasing a deer, killing it. Would you consider that disorder?
Well, I would consider that it involves suffering.
Suffering, yes. So are we saying that it is natural in nature and in human beings to suffer, to go through agonies, to live in disorder?
Yes.
So what do you say to that, sir?
Well, I think that's the way it's looked at by the therapists. To some degree, it's felt that this arises in the course of development, and that some people have it more than others, suffering. Some people are more fortunate in their upbringing, for example, or in their heredity. But it isn't questioned that that may not be necessary in any absolute sense. Well, that's what we're questioning.
That's what I would like to question too.
Yeah.
Dr. Sheldrake says it is accepted. It's like that.
Mm-hmm.
Human condition is to suffer, to struggle, to have anxiety, pain, disorder. That's his condition.
It's certainly